So welcome to the live symposium workshop, and I will just start by introducing our keynote speaker, Chris Granger, who many of you probably already know, but I first heard of Chris when he did a Kickstarter for a new IDE called Light Table, which quickly then turned into a Y Combinator thing, right? But then after that, he upped the game to try and come up with a whole new solution for programming, not just an IDE, called Eve. And it was quite an interesting, if at the end perhaps sad, story. So he's going to tell us that story, and hopefully there is morals that we will learn from it. Thanks, Chris.
So I'm going to start with a little disclaimer. This is not an academic talk by any stretch of the imagination. Jonathan asked me to come here and tell a story. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you sort of behind the scenes, all the stuff we've never talked about in all the talks I've done over the years. And sort of walk you through how this whole thing started and what it was like to do this as a startup. So our story starts all the way back in 2012. And this is my best friend from high school, Robert, and we had decided we wanted to start a company. And him being a cell biologist, me being a programmer, we were of course working on medical software at the time. And we had applied to Y Combinator with this crazy medical software thing we were doing. But I ended up down at my grandmother's house and didn't have internet, so I couldn't work on our stuff. And I spent the week throwing together some ideas that I had left over from when I was at Microsoft about how we could make maybe a slightly better IDE. And I was really deeply involved in the Clojure community at the time, so this was very like a Clojure-y focused thing. And I put this blog post up when I got back to San Francisco, sort of thinking nobody would care about it. It was this weird off-the-wall Clojure IDE thing that I had put together. It had a bunch of cool ideas in it, so one of the things, this one's a little hard to see, but one of the things that we were showing here was being able to show data flowing through your actual program. So we were doing this, we would show your code with the variables substituted to show you the actual values. And one of the big ideas here was that you were directly connected to whatever the thing you were building was. And so we could do crazy things like show data flow through your program. There were also some nice small talky kinds of things going on here where you had sort of a canvas of code and you had your running program on here. And you could lay things out however you wanted. And so like I said, I put this up thinking no one would care. I was actually meeting with an old friend of mine. We went out to lunch, and when I got back, this is what I found. It turned out that this was the largest launch Hacker News had ever had. It had blown up on Reddit. Within the first 2 days, we had gotten over 200,000 views on this video that I put up. Apparently, people did care. Much to our surprise. And they were screaming, as Jonathan pointed out, to put this thing on Kickstarter, which was a relatively new thing back then. That wasn't like a well-understood thing. And so this put Robert and I in kind of a weird place, because we were working on this medical software, but here we have this thing that people are screaming, oh, go do this thing instead. And so we ultimately decided, well, let's just try and do the Kickstarter thing and see what happens, and then we'll decide. We punted. Turned out it worked really well. Astoundingly, people were very excited about this. And at the time, this is the largest software Kickstarter they'd ever had outside of video games. And so Robert and I sat down and we went, well, I know to Robert this is not exactly his domain, like he's not a programmer. Why would we do this together? What was the actual goal here? And more importantly, I had worked on IDEs and programming tools for a long time. Is that what I wanted to do again? And we ultimately decided that what our goal here really was to make programming more accessible, right? That's what we really cared about. And maybe along the way we can make people a little bit more efficient, but maybe we could take this as an opportunity to make sure that people like himself, who was doing stem cell research, weren't spending weeks at a time screwing around in Excel just trying to do repeatable experiments, right? And I mentioned earlier that we had applied to Y Combinator. which if you don't know is a famous startup accelerator. While the Kickstarter was going on, we got a rejection letter from YC for our medical app. So unsurprisingly, we decided to scrap that idea and then immediately reapplied late at that point with Lighttable. And they never saw our application. So I ended up emailing Paul Graham at this point going, hey, we're getting interest from VCs asking about potentially investing in us. We don't know what the world we're doing. Could you let us know if you're interested? And PG emails back and goes, you applied. He goes, digs it up. An hour later, he sends me back an email. He goes, how about you come down here Monday and we'll do an interview? There are lots and lots of stories I could tell you about Y Combinator. I'm not going to do that because I only have an hour. But I will say that interview was probably one of the worst experiences we had ever had, and we walked out of it in silence, convinced that we had failed. So it was a very big surprise when we got an email from their call from them later saying that they wanted us in. It turned out that they were basically trolling us the whole time. So yeah, that was fun. So the way Y Combinator works is it's a 3-month program, and you go through it with a big batch of other startups. And they're sort of teaching you the ropes, effectively, and helping you build something that people want, as the tagline goes. And at the very end, you end in a thing called Demo Day, where they invite, nowadays, it's like 500 of the world's best investors to come into a room, and you get up on stage, and you get 2.5 minutes to pitch them. Now, keep in mind, there were 100 startups in our batch. We were the biggest batch Y Combinator had ever had at that point in time. You get 2.5 minutes to make people remember you in a batch of 100. And so PG's advice to us, Paul Graham's advice to us was go up there and scare the crap out of them. It's kind of a weird thing to do. He's like, go up there, convince them that you're the next GitHub, and that they're going to miss you like they miss GitHub. So that's what I did. I went up and gave this very dramatic presentation, and amazingly enough, it worked. We ended up walking out as one of the top 10 companies. I kid you not, I shook MC Hammer's hand, who was excited to invest in us. There are a lot of weird stories like that. And amusingly enough, we also walked out one of the most sought after, as a programming tool, companies in the batch. We ended up with 60 leads to institutional investors, which is nuts. So we did what every Y Combinator startup is supposed to do, go follow the leads. Despite doing very well with our presentation, we were way, way too early for institutional investment. We needed angel investment. Weirdly enough, we got not a single angel hit in all of our leads. They were all institutional investors. We didn't really understand how hard that was going to be until around meeting 40, where we realized after 40 some odd no's that maybe this wasn't worth our time anymore. We had spent almost 2 months doing nothing but going to meeting after meeting after meeting with VCs, which if you've never done that can be pretty soul-sucking. It's tough to constantly be super excited and ready to pitch your startup to a bunch of people you know are basically not there half the time. So we did what we knew how to do. We said, well, we have the Kickstarter money. We don't need to hire anyone right now, right? It's just the two of us. Let's just go do what we know how to do. Let's go build stuff. And so we went through a number of different versions of Lighttable, sort of upgrading it each time, making it a little bit more powerful than it was previously. We started to see some of the really interesting and cool stuff we had talked about before. We were showing data flow through the system and all of that. And then around version 4, things really started to come together. This was when we had an IDE that we were using all the time. It was the only thing we were really using, and we had done some really, really neat work to do some things that JavaScript and Python and Clojure weren't really meant to do. So in this particular instance, this version of the thing that you're seeing here, we had actually gone in and patched V8 so that we could get into the function tables and start replacing things at runtime and doing all sorts of crazy stuff to capture values and pull them out. This ended up being way, way harder than we originally expected it to be, right? Like, oh, these are pretty dynamic languages. It shouldn't be hard to do some of these things. Not true. It could be pretty tough. And it was around this time that we're like, okay, we've got a thing that's kind of working. We've got a fair number of users. I think around the time this came out, we had something like 10,000 people using it. It's time to do some user studies. So when I was at Microsoft, I got to do an end-to-end study of Visual Studio and watch how people code for a month and a half behind one of these one-way mirrors. And we wanted to see, did light table make any difference, right? We wanted to see, like, did we learn anything? Do people behave differently now that they have a different set of tools? Because remember, our goal was to make sure that we made programming more accessible. It turned out that we could make a career programmer about twice as fast because this did actually change the way you work. However, it did not make programming more accessible at all. It was still the same difficult, busted thing. And I was scheduled to give a talk at Strangeloop that year, which was titled Finding a Way Out. And the talk was about what we thought would be necessary to make programming more accessible. If an IDE maybe isn't enough because the sort of foundation isn't really made for other people, what would be? And I showed a prototype of a thing I put together the week before, so it was pretty rough, that was called Aurora at the time. And
Yeah.
it was...
And what we need to do is extract the time out of each of these.
We really don't
so
need to get
we'll
into it.
extract the value of time.
Anyways, the idea behind it was to take all the things that the industry was super, super excited about at the time. Immutable data, and notebooks, and trying to make, sort of tangible values and all these things. Put it into one place and present it in some semi-reasonable way where you kind of could do this drag and droppy kind of thing and build up something. And surprisingly enough, at least I was surprised, you could build real software this way. It wasn't necessarily the most efficient, but we could build things like to do MVC, which is everybody's benchmark for whatever reason, and do calculations and all sorts of fun things with it. And so I presented this at Strangeloop, and people thought it was kind of cool, and that was about it, because, well, we were focused on light table, right? So we went home, back to San Francisco, released more stuff, released the plugin architecture and all sorts of stuff. Things were going pretty well for us at this point in time. Like light table was actually gaining some real traction, and we decided it was finally time to really hire somebody. We had been interviewing people for quite a while, anytime we came across somebody who seemed really interesting, but nobody ever worked out. As a weird tidbit, half the people we interviewed during that period of time managed to get divorced during our interview period. We were kind of worried that maybe we were cursed or something. Anyways, we managed to find this guy and eventually hired him. So this is Jamie Brandon, and he joined with us. He came all the way from the UK. For the first few months, he kind of worked remote, and we eventually got him here. And like I said, we were doing pretty well at the time. So these are the mythical graphs you're supposed to have as a startup, right? These are the lovely hockey stick growth things. This one is showing that on average, we had over 20% growth month over month. We thought we were doing the right thing. We were at 30 or 40,000 users at this point, and so we were super excited. We finally found somebody. We had great graphs, great numbers, so we emailed Paul Graham, and we're like, okay, we've got about 10 months of runway left, and the conventional wisdom is you need at least 6 to raise a round of money. Hey PG, here's all this great stuff we've done. Can we raise? Can we go do this? And he sent this lovely email. Investors are going to be exceptionally skeptical about a programming tool that has no revenue. They don't like programming tools even with revenue. Beware, you seem to currently be on a trajectory that ends in death. Well, that was fun. This was right around Christmas of this year. It was a wonderful Christmas present, and Robert and I were just sitting there looking at each other like, but we did what we were supposed to do. What's going on? Happy 2014. So we were in trouble because PG said we needed revenue, and frankly, if you need 6 months to raise and you only have 10 months left, at this point, 3 months by the beginning of 2014, 3 months is not enough time to get revenue. And that's when a miracle happened. This guy shows up. So Zubair was a longtime user of Lighttable and had been one of our biggest supporters all throughout the whole thing. Was always super involved in the community. Was really excited about us, and he emailed us and goes, you know, I've been very fortunate. I got really lucky with some Bitcoin stuff early on. I would love to invest in you guys. And we at first thought this was a scam. Second, we then desperately tried to convince him not to do that because we were like, this is just some random dude trying to give us money. Like, we have no idea if this is going to work. Frankly, it's probably not going to work. Like, PG's telling us we're already dead. Like, I don't think you want to do this. And he was adamant. And Zubair honestly saved us. If he had not invested in us when he did, Eve and the rest of it never would have happened. But this put us in a weird spot because PG said we needed to get revenue. And we had a plan for how to eventually get revenue with Lighttable, and that was to build an ecosystem of plugins and build a marketplace and sort of build things up that way, because I know from experience on Visual Studio, you cannot actually sell the tool anymore. You can only sell things that make the tool better. The problem was that was going to take quite a while, right? We needed to continue to grow the community, and it was going to be quite a while before people were going to be willing to invest money into the tool itself. And so this led us to a very hard decision. It was either keep working on Lighttable and die, because there was no hope for us to eventually make money out of it in any reasonable time frame, or find something that will. And we ended up making the hard choice. Lighttable was always supposed to be open source. That was just part of the Kickstarter thing. But at this point in time, we decided that we were going to open source it and find new maintainers for it. We had to find something else that was going to eventually make us money. And that's when our good friend Aurora came back. We're like, well, unlike Lighttable, which is very much targeted at programming as it exists now, and these are all people who don't pay for anything and think they can go build it themselves, Aurora was about trying to get to people like Robert, people who were physicists and biologists, and people who are sort of reluctant programmers if they program at all. And those people will pay for services because they don't know how to set up a server. And so this was a much clearer way for us to eventually make money. And so we cleaned up the prototype a bit, and unfortunately I don't actually have a real picture of the one we eventually showed to people. I don't know why we didn't take a picture of it, but the gist of it was we cleaned it up quite a bit and got it to look pretty nice. And then I was at the opening of Brett Victor's lab in San Francisco, and this was an awesome opportunity for me to go and show a bunch of people, really smart people, like this crazy thing we had built, and see what they thought about it. And what was particularly great about this is there were lots of folks here who weren't programmers, just brilliant scientists and all these things, exactly the kind of people we ultimately wanted to hit. And as I demoed it to people, like there was tons of people who got really, really excited. They thought it was really cool and it was beautiful and like, wow, this is neat, the things you're showing me. And so I'm like, great, you sit down and you try it. And then I watched in horror as not a single person was able to do even the most basic thing inside of this system. So I don't know if you've ever seen this diagram before, but this is the diagram Paul Graham draws, giving you this sort of startup journey here. This was us right then. We were told we were dying. We were told that, that our stuff wasn't good enough. We had no idea how to make money. The one idea we had for trying to make something make money had just failed miserably with literally the best possible test group. Where do we go from here? Well, Jamie came in handy here because Jamie has a background in computer science and in mathematics. I'm a German major. I do not have that background. And he was like, well, there's a lot of research out there. Let's go look at some. And specifically, he had heard about these guys out of Berkeley some time ago that were working at a lab called the Boom Lab, which stands for the Berkeley Orders of Magnitude Lab. And these were our kind of people. So they were specifically focused on orders of magnitude smaller, orders of magnitude simpler, and orders of magnitude faster. Truly our people. And they were bringing back this dead language from the 70s called data log and using it to build distributed systems. And they showed a whole bunch of insanely great results out of their work. They were rebuilding like parts of Hadoop in 7,000 lines of code that were 500,000 lines in production. And they were doing it faster and with more features. And so we're like, okay, that's pretty interesting. Maybe we could do something with that. Now, of course, anybody who knows anything about data log, and the man up here in the front certainly does, knows that it's very, very hard to make data log fast. As a matter of fact, it was effectively an unsolved problem at the time. And it was folks like Todd out of Logic Blocks who were the only people who had found a way to make data log reasonably efficient. And so we started reading papers like this to learn, okay, we don't know enough right now to make a fast data log implementation. What would that mean? And by the way, if you haven't read either of those two papers, I very highly recommend you do. This one especially is very easy to approach and is really, really cool. It fundamentally changed the way I think about a lot of things. And so great, research. I had never read an academic paper before, but now I was. Jamie was teaching me, let's do this. We came up with a plan. We have a lot of whiteboards, and I kept cutting slides out of this deck because it's already too long, so you're not going to see as many of them as I originally had. But we came up with this plan, and we're like, okay, we can do this. We think we can turn this into something. And it was around this time that we changed our name from Aurora, as we had previously called it, because it turned out no one could spell it. And it was really, really bad for non-native English speakers. Nobody could understand what the word was. We're like, we always had this really global community with light tables, so it was really important for us not to like disenfranchise a bunch of people with a stupid name. And so we were moving forward, we were okay again, we got out of the trough. And that's when something very unexpected happened. Apple released Swift, which might not seem like a big deal. However, if you were there for the introduction of Swift, you will know that they also introduced a new version of Xcode. And if you went to Chris Latner's homepage, who is the director of the Apple Tools division, you look down there, he made it very clear that the playgrounds were heavily influenced by Lighttable. Now, again, you might think, okay, that's really exciting. Like, Apple, of all people, had done something related to Lighttable. And as a matter of fact, eventually all the big guys would. However, this was pretty bad news for us. It meant that we literally had no hope of ever monetizing Lighttable. This was basically the end of that as a company. Because as soon as Apple and Microsoft and Google start playing in that space, no one's ever going to believe we can make money, even if we could beat them at their own game. So, we had been all hyped up, then this happened, back down we go. Right, this is a bit of a rough time, but we pulled through it, and we eventually came to this crazy thing. So, we had built this prototype based on Datalog, and it could do all sorts of really cool stuff. So it was building to do MVC, like I said, everybody's base benchmark. It actually bootstrapped this entire IDE, and like I said, it was based on the work that the Boon Lab guys had done. The IDE took us a week. It was 600 lines of code. There's that orders of magnitude we were talking about. This was super, super exciting. And it was kind of neat because it had an interesting side effect to it, which is that it kind of started to look a little bit like the holy grail of programming. This reads like English, right? And so we were pretty excited. We had a thing that kind of seemed like it was going to work. And okay, now what we need to do? Go talk to people about it. And we got very, very lucky. Finally something good happened. And it was that this guy emailed me out of the blue. Completely cool. So if you don't know who this is Chris Dixon. He is a very, very famous investor, used to be an angel investor, and had fairly recently become a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, which if you don't know anything about venture capital, this is generally considered one of, if not the best venture capitalists in the world. And so getting an email cold from this guy was a big, big deal. As a matter of fact, we had no idea what to do with it, so we sat on it for a day and went around and tried to find Paul Graham, who wouldn't answer us back. So we were just like, okay, well, let's just see what happens and go to coffee or whatever. And at this point in time, we realized that we could spin this around a bit. So this was awful, right? Yes, we could never make money on Lighttable again. However, it did mean we heavily influenced the giants of our industry, right? That was a big deal because now, no, we can't say that we're going to turn Lighttable into something, but we had a new thing it was compelling and that we did have a story for making money for. And now we had a track record, effectively, of saying, hey, look, 2 guys moved the giants. And at that point in time, actually, because of this announcement, we did start weirdly getting some VC interest because some people had heard about what we were doing. And so when I met Chris and sat down for coffee and showed him what we had done, he goes, okay, sounds like you're getting some interest. How about you pitch the partnership in 2 weeks? Now, remember I said it takes 6 months usually to go through this process. To prepare and be ready to give a presentation to the Andreessen-Horowitz partnership in 2 weeks was craziness. I said yes, stupidly. And so, off we go. 2 weeks later, I'm in this room. This is the actual room I was in. And I pitched this crazy programming tool that nobody was ever going to believe in to a room full of billionaire, 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 billionaire. Amusingly enough, usually these meetings actually don't have very many people in them, especially for an investment as small as ours. It would be just a couple of the people from the partnership. But Dixon had gone around talking us up to everyone there, and so this room was standing room only. As a matter of fact, Mark Andreessen of Andreessen and Horowitz was standing in the doorway over here the whole time. And this presentation went surprisingly well until the very last bit of it, at which point the partners started arguing among themselves, and I was just kind of like standing there, like a little scared, not knowing what to do. Then it ended, and everyone was really excited, and like came and shook my hand. So I'm like, okay, this was probably awful, but we'll see what happens. Turned out they loved it, and we managed to raise a $2 million seed round from one of the best investors in the world. Holy crap, like this is ridiculous, on a programming tool, which is even crazier. And so this meant we could finally stop working out of my apartment. Now this might seem like a small thing, but it was a huge, huge emotional thing for us. It meant we were much more real. It meant we had the opportunity to not pay ourselves quite literally minimum wage the entire time in the valley, which is insane. And we could like pay ourselves slightly less, or slightly more than minimum wage, although not very much. And so we did what you're supposed to do. We went to a big trip to IKEA, bought a bunch of furniture, put it together. Now we had an office. And I want to point out the most important feature of our office, which is this wall of stickies here. So you might think this is how we did planning, but it isn't. This was what we called the wall of wind. And so this is something I don't think we talk about enough, certainly in general when doing hard work, but definitely in startups, which is that we went through a lot of low periods there. There was a lot of existential angst, right, where it was kind of clear that important people were telling us we weren't going to make it. And so what we started to do was we started to write down the things that we actually managed to accomplish. We didn't know it at the time, but what we had basically signed up to do was cutting-edge programming language research, cutting-edge database research, and cutting-edge HCI research as 3 guys with no real background in doing any of that on a startup time frame on top of it all. This was tough. There were a lot of dead ends. There was a lot of things that weren't going to work. It seemed like we would take 1 step forward, 2 steps back half the time. We needed to remind ourselves emotionally, just to make sure we could keep going, that we were actually making progress, that we were doing tons of stuff. And every month we would clear the wall and there would be hundreds of stickies on this thing. We were doing a ton of work for 3 guys, and we should be proud of that. And so the wall of wind helped us get through some things. So despite all of our wins though, this thing was not one of them, much to our surprise. So when we tested this out, and we tested all of our prototypes of Eve out with people, we found out that this was not, in fact, any better than programming as it is today, because it still made you simulate everything you were doing up here. And despite the model being a little bit more understandable, despite it reading in English, people struggled with it just as much as they did before. And so we started to look at, okay, let's go back to the drawing board a bit. We have a little bit more time. We can actually think this through a little better. Let's go do some research. And we went to the only programming tool that has ever been accessible, which is Excel. And we did a bunch of research. So we dug in, we didn't just do like literature research, we actually went to companies, like, show me how you use Excel, let me sit down with you, tell me the stories. We got a lot of crazy stories out of this. For example, there's a spreadsheet at a well-known, one of the biggest cruise lines in the world that is 7 gigs in size, has been built over the past 20 years, no programmer has ever touched it. They would go to lunch anytime they updated it because it took a couple hours to actually coalesce even. But it ran their entire business. So, what do you know? And it turned out after collecting a bunch of information and sort of digging into this, we found lots of people take different things away from Excel. For us, the most important thing we learned was that every action you take in this environment gives you value. And that stands in very, very stark contrast to our programming languages, where if I'm writing a Python script, I get literally nothing out of it until I've written the entire thing, until it is complete. Whereas if all I do is type a number in one of these cells, I immediately get something out of that. Turns out this is one of the cruxes of trying to make an accessible programming environment. Now, we had no idea how to do that, so we went back to what we did know and tried to take some of the principles we learned and apply them to it. And we built this version of Eve, which had, you know, this textual syntax over here on the left, which was still not quite as good as it could be, but as you were writing this, you got something that was much more concrete, something that did provide you value as quickly as possible. And this was actually a really neat prototype. We never released it, but this one you could compile stuff from within the system itself, and it could also spawn processes and do all sorts of crazy things. And so we had you know, programs spawning in other threads, talking to other programs based on data log. Whoa, this stuff actually kind of works, right? Like, you could make this into a general purpose programming thing. That was a big revelation for us, and we really started to dig deep into that. And that's when 2015 rolled around. We had an office, and we had raised money, ostensibly to hire people. And it was really hard hiring for Eve, but we did eventually find 2 guys to hire. So in late 2014, we technically hired them, but they didn't join until 2015. We managed to hire Josh and Corey. And so Josh dropped out of college, moved to the Valley and joined Palm, and then worked at a couple of startups. The way we found out about Josh was before we had released a plugin architecture for Lighttable, he had gone and reverse engineered the compiled closure script we had written the thing in to add plugins himself. We were pretty excited to hire Josh. And Corey has one of the coolest backgrounds of anybody I've ever heard. So he was at a PhD program at Lehigh, and he was doing his PhD in machine learning and robotics. What made it so cool was he was building a plane that never had to land because it harnessed energy from wind currents, like an albatross does. That's pretty cool stuff. And so we hired them. And this is when I made one of my first rookie managerial mistakes. These were unbelievably brilliant, fantastic hires. And one of the things I didn't spend enough time doing was onboarding them. We sort of just expected, okay, they're brilliant people, we're going to throw them in the pool and see what happens. And they did great. This is not on them, this is on me. They did great, but even at that point in time, we worked pretty strangely. You know, we had developed, at this point we were on this really weird research productization thing that we were doing. And we had developed some kind of unusual ideas about how to build stuff this way. And one of those, I really love this quote, "The dirty secret of open source is it's not free as in beer, it's free as in a puppy." This ended up being something we really attached ourselves to at some level. Every time we took a dependency on something someone else had written, it came back and it bit us hard. When we were talking about building versions of Eve, we typically built one a month from scratch. When we were talking about building things, you know, at that speed, losing 2 weeks to a bug in React was bad. Losing weeks of time because it turned out that one of our dependencies was just ridiculously slow was bad. And so we ended up being very, very skeptical of our notion of software reuse in the industry as is today, because it turned out that it almost always took us less time to write the thing we actually needed than to use some random thing that was meant to be general. And that's unusual for people, right? If you're coming from industry, everyone tells you, go use Angular at the time, or go use React a little bit later. For Josh and Corey coming into this, it was pretty unusual. They're like, no, we're not going to do that. We wrote our own version at 600 lines, and it's about 20 times faster than what's out there. Right. Another weird thing was we learned pretty early on that really innocuous mistakes early in a code base sort of exponentiate as you get bigger. Right? The traditional wisdom is that the way you write good software is you build a thing, and then you refactor it, and you build some more, and you refactor it, and you build some more, and you refactor it. And we were trying to build an IDE, a full compiler and language stack, and a relational database by ourselves in a month. We had to keep it small. We had to keep it simple, right? And we learned that when we tried to do the traditional method of working, it didn't work very well because those little mistakes compounded and compounded and compounded. And it got to the point where this was making stupid decisions because something all the way back there was. And it was basically impossible to fix it because that really meant rewriting the whole thing. So we developed a pattern of bulldozing it. Every single time, with the exception of one, we completely wrote everything from scratch. We didn't take anything we had used before. Because every single time we built a version of E, we had learned a ton about what not to do. And we wanted to make sure that we carried that forward with us. And so we had these weird ways of working. On top of that, at that point in time, Jamie and I were deep in the throes of trying to make data logs super fast. And we were reading papers like this one, which has amazing results and is 80 pages long and is incredibly sophisticated math. Along gets to work with Hung, who's an absolute genius, without question. This is a hard paper. And the work in this space was all really hard. It was all really new. People were still trying to figure this out. And so we were trying to figure this out ourselves. And if you're not used to that kind of stuff, which ourselves we weren't, but certainly Josh and Corey definitely weren't, this is a weird place to be. And we should have helped them get up to speed a little bit better than we did. Now, all that being said, we had 2 more people, and they were doing stuff. And so the next big event that was in our schedule, and I'm necessarily skipping over lots and lots of versions of Eve in here, but the next big event we had was I got invited to do the keynote at the Joy of Coding in the Netherlands. And this was a bit of a rough time for us. So this is a picture I took at 4 in the morning, the day before the keynote, which was at 7 a.m. And I'm still sitting here desperately trying to get things to work. Finishing up the talk at the same time. And the next day I go in and I'm going to give a talk. This is kind of what the room. It's actually a really neat venue. I was going to give a talk in here, and I was going to show this crazy monstrosity, which you're not going to understand. Please don't try to understand. And during this thing, it was just a nightmare to get this thing working to begin with and get it all set up. But we did manage to show something kind of cool, which was that we built an entire clone of Foursquare in this thing, and it was literally nothing like programming. This was one of the first versions where it just never felt like programming. Us using it, it felt like this weird magical thing that we were working with, and we managed to build a clone of a production website, which was pretty cool. However, during my demo, this thing broke. Unsurprisingly, this is a thing that happens. And I've done lots of presentations before. I know how to deal with that and recover from it. But it broke pretty badly. And I was on not a lot of sleep. And people will forgive you quite a bit when you're up here on stage. But for us, this was like, we just did something awful. Everything about this process was bad. And it was very, very stressful for everybody on the team on top of that. And so this was another pretty low point for us, to be honest. I flew back from the Netherlands. Everyone there thought it was amazing and awesome, and they kept, congratulating and thanking me. And here I'm going, this was